going down! Somebody help me!
The night the disaster began looked like any other flight over the Pacific Ocean, but within a few hours it would become the moment that completely destroyed one man's ordinary life and forced him into a brutal fight for survival. High above the dark ocean, a large cargo aircraft was flying through heavy clouds. Inside the plane were dozens of sealed delivery packages stacked carefully in cargo nets. The aircraft belonged to an international shipping company that specialized in delivering packages across continents as quickly as possible. Among the few passengers on board was a man named Chuck Nolan. Chuck was a senior systems analyst for the company. His entire career revolved around time, efficiency, and discipline. He believed every second had value. Delays annoyed him, mistakes frustrated him, and he lived his life constantly chasing schedules. Before boarding this flight, Chuck had been celebrating Christmas with his girlfriend Kelly. Their relationship had been growing stronger for years, and they had already started talking about marriage. During that Christmas dinner, Kelly had given Chuck a small but meaningful gift, a silver pocket watch. Inside the watch was a tiny photograph of her. Chuck promised he would return soon. Neither of them knew that promise would become almost impossible to keep. Now, thousands of feet above the Pacific Ocean, the plane suddenly began shaking. At first, it was just light turbulence, but within minutes, the shaking grew worse. The aircraft had entered a powerful storm system that stretched across the ocean like a wall of chaos. Dark thunderclouds surrounded the plane. Lightning flashed violently outside the windows, lighting up the sky in terrifying bursts of white. Heavy rain slammed against the metal body of the aircraft like thousands of small bullets. Inside the cockpit, the pilots were growing increasingly worried. The storm was stronger than expected. Wind speeds were pushing the plane off course, and the instruments were starting to behave strangely. Inside the cabin, Chuck stood up and walked toward the small restroom located near the back of the aircraft. He was completely unaware of the dangerous situation developing around him. Just as he entered the restroom and closed the door, the plane suddenly dropped violently in the air. Chuck grabbed the wall to steady himself. The lights flickered. A loud warning alarm began echoing through the aircraft. At the same moment, the air pressure inside the cabin suddenly dropped. The restroom door burst open. Chuck stumbled forward as the plane shook even harder. From the cargo section came a loud, crashing sound as several heavy packages broke loose from their restraints. The pilots were now shouting emergency commands inside the cockpit. Then, without warning, a powerful explosion ripped through the cargo hold. Flames burst from one of the damaged containers as sparks flew through the air. The explosion shook the aircraft so violently that Chuck was thrown against the wall. Smoke quickly began filling the cabin. The pilots realized the terrifying truth. The plane had suffered major damage. The fire was spreading, and several critical systems were failing. They had only one option left: an emergency ocean landing. One of the pilots rushed out of the cockpit and grabbed Chuck by the arm. "Sit down. Now." Chuck barely had time to react before he was pushed into a passenger seat and strapped in tightly. The pilot quickly handed him an inflatable life raft and pointed to a life jacket. "We are going down. When we hit the water, grab the raft and get out." Chuck's heart was racing now. Outside the small window beside him, lightning illuminated the massive waves below. The plane was losing altitude quickly. Suddenly, Chuck noticed something that made his stomach drop. His pocket watch was missing. He immediately looked down. The small silver watch had fallen onto the floor several feet away during the turbulence. For a moment he hesitated. The plane shook again. The pilot shouted, "Stay in your seat." But Chuck ignored him. That watch was the last gift Kelly had given him. Without thinking, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stumbled across the shaking cabin toward the watch. At that exact moment, the aircraft tilted sharply downward. Cargo containers slammed across the floor. Chuck lost his balance and crashed against the sidewall. But he managed to grab the watch just before another violent jolt hit the plane. Behind him, the pilot turned and realized Chuck was no longer seated. He immediately unbuckled his own safety belt and tried to reach him. But the turbulence was too strong. A sudden violent shake threw the pilot across the cabin, slamming him into a metal container. Back in the cockpit, the remaining pilot was struggling desperately to keep control. The ocean was rushing closer. The storm outside had become even more violent. Lightning flashed across the sky, revealing enormous waves rising far below. The pilot prepared for impact. Moments later, the aircraft slammed into the ocean surface. The impact was brutal. Water exploded across the cabin windows as the plane skidded violently across the surface before beginning to sink. Inside the cabin, icy seawater burst through broken sections of the fuselage. Because Chuck's seatbelt was not fastened, the force of the impact threw him forward instead of trapping him in his seat. For a brief moment, that mistake may have saved his life. Suddenly, the upper section of the plane tore open. A massive rush of ocean water flooded the cabin. Everything inside began sinking. Chuck grabbed the inflatable life raft with both hands and tried to deploy it. But the raft's cord became tangled in twisted metal from the wreckage. The sinking aircraft began dragging the raft, and Chuck downward into the dark ocean. Chuck struggled desperately, pulling at the rope. The water pulled him deeper. His lungs burned as he tried to hold his breath. For a terrifying moment, it seemed certain he would drown along with the plane. Then suddenly the rope snapped. The life raft shot upward toward the surface, pulling Chuck along with it. Seconds later, he burst out of the water, gasping desperately for air. The storm was still raging. Huge waves crashed around him from every direction. Chuck tried to climb onto the raft, but every time he pulled himself up, another wave slammed him back into the water. Finally, with the last strength left in his body, he grabbed the edge of the raft and refused to let go. The ocean tossed him around violently. Then a new danger appeared. A burning aircraft engine was still spinning in the water nearby. The powerful current created by the engine began pulling Chuck toward it. Realizing the danger, Chuck closed his eyes tightly. Then suddenly the engine exploded. A massive shockwave blasted through the water, throwing Chuck far away from the wreckage. Moments later, the remains of the aircraft slowly disappeared beneath the waves. The plane was gone. Chuck was now completely alone in the middle of the endless ocean. He held tightly onto the rope of the raft as towering waves lifted him high into the air and dropped him back down again. Time passed. Minutes turned into hours. Chuck had no idea how long he drifted in the storm. Eventually, the waves began to calm. The sky slowly grew brighter as morning approached. Then suddenly the raft scraped against something sharp. The air inside it began leaking out. Chuck looked down and realized what had happened. The raft had been torn open by rocks, which meant one thing: land. Using the last bit of energy left in his exhausted body, Chuck dragged himself toward the shore. His muscles screamed with pain as he pulled the damaged raft across the wet sand. Finally, completely drained of strength, he collapsed. Darkness took over. When Chuck finally woke up, warm sunlight was shining on his face. For several seconds he simply lay there, confused and disoriented. Then the memories rushed back. The storm, the explosion, the crash. He slowly sat up and looked around. The sight that greeted him filled him with both relief and fear. He had washed up on a small tropical island. Palm trees swayed gently in the warm wind. White sand stretched along the coastline. But something was terribly wrong. There were no buildings, no boats, No signs of civilization. Just ocean. Ocean in every direction. Chuck stood up slowly and began walking along the beach, hoping to find other survivors. Maybe the pilots had made it. Maybe someone else had escaped the crash. He searched the shoreline for hours. He called out repeatedly, but no one answered. Only the sound of waves breaking against the shore echoed back. As the sun began setting, a terrifying realization slowly began forming in his mind. He might be completely alone. That night, Chuck sat on the beach staring out at the dark ocean. Somewhere out there was the world he once knew. A world filled with people, cities, and time schedules. But here, none of that existed anymore. The next morning, Chuck began exploring the island. Pieces of wreckage from the plane had washed ashore overnight. Broken cargo boxes were scattered along the sand. Chuck began collecting anything that might help him survive. He found several unopened delivery packages that had survived the crash. Even though he was stranded, Chuck still felt strangely responsible for them. He placed them carefully in a small pile near the beach. For now, his first priority was simple. He needed water, and he needed food. Without those, he would not survive more than a few days. As he explored deeper into the island, Chuck realized something disturbing. The island was small. Very small. He climbed a rocky hill hoping to see ships or land somewhere in the distance. But when he reached the top, the view crushed his hopes. There was nothing. Just endless ocean stretching to the horizon. The island was completely isolated. That meant rescue might take weeks, maybe months, or maybe it would never come. Chuck returned to the beach and used driftwood to spell one desperate word in the sand. Help. It was the only signal he could think of. All he could do now was wait and hope that some passing ship might see it. Night came quickly on the island. As darkness covered the jungle, strange animal sounds began echoing through the trees. Chuck sat alone beside the weak remains of the broken raft. Every shadow seemed dangerous. Every noise felt like a threat. For the first time in his life, Chuck Nolan truly understood what fear felt like. Not fear of deadlines. Not fear of failure. But the deep, primitive fear of being completely alone in the wild. And this was only the beginning of the fight that would change him forever. The next few days on the island were the hardest Chuck had ever experienced in his life. Back in the civilized world, Chuck's days had always been filled with schedules, meetings, and constant movement. Every minute had purpose. Every hour had a plan. But here on this forgotten island, time felt completely different. The sun rose. The sun set. And nothing else changed. There were no clocks. No phones. No voices. Just silence. On the first morning after the crash, Chuck woke up with a painful dryness in his throat. His lips were cracked, and his body felt weak from dehydration. He realized that finding drinkable water had to become his top priority. Without water, the human body can only survive a few days. Chuck began searching the island desperately. He walked along the beach and through the trees, hoping to find a small stream or a natural water source. But the island seemed completely dry. There were coconut trees everywhere, but Chuck had no idea how to open the hard shells. By midday, the sun was burning intensely above him. Sweat poured down his face as he continued searching. Finally, exhausted, he sat down beside a palm tree and stared at one of the coconuts lying in the sand. He picked it up and shook it. Inside, he could hear liquid. Water. But the shell was extremely tough. Chuck tried smashing it against a rock, but it barely cracked. He tried hitting it again and again until his hands began to hurt. Frustrated, he threw the coconut across the sand. The situation slowly began sinking into his mind. He had no tools, no knife, no shelter, no way to start a fire, and no idea how long he would be trapped here. As evening approached, Chuck returned to the beach where he had stacked the cargo packages that washed ashore from the crash. There were several of them. Each one was sealed tightly in waterproof packaging. Chuck looked at them for a long moment. Inside those packages could be tools, food, something that might help him survive. But something inside him refused to open them. For years, Chuck had worked for the shipping company that delivered those packages. Their entire system was built on trust. Customers trusted that their packages would arrive unopened and intact. Even though he was stranded on an island, Chuck still felt responsible for them. It might sound strange, but maintaining that sense of responsibility gave him a feeling that his life before the crash still mattered. So he decided not to open them. At least not yet. Instead, Chuck began building a simple resting place using pieces of driftwood and broken parts from the damaged raft. It wasn't much, just a small area protected from the wind, but it was better than sleeping directly on the sand. That night was long and uncomfortable. Chuck barely slept. Strange noises echoed from the jungle. Animals moved in the darkness. Every time a branch snapped, Chuck felt his heart jump in fear. The next morning he woke up with the same problem. Water. He returned to the coconuts scattered along the beach. This time he found a sharp piece of stone and began smashing the coconut repeatedly. After several painful attempts, the shell finally cracked open. Clear coconut water spilled out. Chuck quickly lifted it to his lips and drank. The cool liquid flowed down his throat. In that moment, it tasted better than anything he had ever had before. It felt like pure life. After drinking, Chuck used the broken shell to scoop out the soft coconut meat and ate it slowly. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him a little strength. Now that he had food and water, Chuck knew he needed to solve another major problem. Fire. Without fire he couldn't cook food, purify water, or protect himself from animals. So he began trying to create it the most primitive way possible. He gathered dry sticks and pieces of wood and began rubbing them together to create friction. At first he was confident. He had seen survival techniques on television before. It didn't look that hard. But after hours of rubbing sticks together, nothing happened. No smoke. No spark. Just exhaustion. Chuck kept trying. His hands became red and sore. Still nothing. He tried again the next day. And the next. But every attempt failed. The sun burned his skin during the day. At night the cold wind chilled him. Days slowly turned into weeks. Chuck adapted to island life piece by piece. He learned how to collect morning dew from leaves using coconut shells. He sharpened a wooden stick into a spear and began practicing catching fish in shallow water. Most of the time he missed. Sometimes he slipped on rocks and fell into the water. But slowly, he improved. One day, after dozens of failed attempts, Chuck finally managed to stab a small fish. Holding that fish in his hands felt like a major victory. But another problem remained. Without fire, he had to eat it raw. The taste was unpleasant, but hunger forced him to swallow it anyway. Life on the island became a daily struggle of survival. One afternoon, while exploring the shoreline, Chuck noticed something floating in the water. It was the body of one of the pilots from the crashed plane. The sight filled Chuck with sadness. He carefully dragged the body onto the beach and searched the pilot's uniform. Inside the pockets he found a few useful items: a pair of sturdy shoes, a small flashlight, and a damaged wallet. Chuck decided to give the pilot a proper burial. He dug a grave in the sand using a piece of metal debris from the wreckage. After placing the body inside, he covered it with sand and marked the location with a large stone. For a long moment, Chuck stood there silently. Looking at that grave forced him to confront a terrifying thought. One day, that grave could belong to him. That night, Chuck couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the possibility that no one would ever find him. If rescue never came, he might die alone on this island. The thought filled him with dread. But the next morning, something unexpected happened. While gathering firewood near the beach, Chuck noticed a faint light far out on the ocean. First he thought it might be a reflection, but then the light moved. It was a ship. A real ship. Chuck immediately began shouting and waving his arms. He grabbed the flashlight and started flashing it toward the distant vessel. For a moment, hope filled his heart. But the ship was too far away. The weak light from the flashlight was barely visible across the dark water. Slowly, painfully, the ship disappeared into the distance. Chuck stood on the beach watching until the last tiny light vanished. His chance at rescue was gone. Frustration and anger exploded inside him. He screamed at the ocean. He threw rocks. He cursed the sky. But none of it changed anything. The island remained silent. The next morning, Chuck made a decision. If rescue wasn't coming to him, then maybe he needed to go find it himself. The decision to leave the island was not something Chuck made lightly. For weeks he had hoped that someone would eventually notice the plane had disappeared and begin searching the ocean. He believed that rescue teams might arrive at any moment. But as time passed, that hope slowly faded. The island remained silent. No planes flew overhead. No ships passed near the shore. The giant ocean surrounding him felt like an endless wall separating him from the rest of the world. Chuck realized something important. If he stayed here and waited forever, he might die without anyone ever knowing he had survived the crash. So he decided to attempt the impossible. He would try to cross the ocean. Of course, he knew the idea was extremely dangerous. The waves around the island were strong, and the currents could easily drag him far away. But staying on the island forever was not a life either. Chuck began studying the shoreline carefully. Every day he watched the movement of the waves and the direction of the wind. He noticed that large waves crashed violently against the rocks surrounding the island. That meant escaping with a small raft would not be easy. The water pushed everything back toward the shore. Still, Chuck refused to give up. He dragged the damaged life raft from the beach and tried using it to paddle away from the island. At first he believed it might work. He pushed the raft into the water and climbed on top of it. But within seconds, the waves slammed into him. A powerful surge lifted the raft high into the air and threw it back toward the rocks. Chuck tried again and again. Each attempt ended the same way. The ocean forced him back. During one of those attempts, something terrible happened. As Chuck struggled against the waves, his leg struck a sharp rock hidden beneath the water. A deep cut opened along his thigh. Blood quickly spread into the water around him. The pain was intense. Barely able to stand, Chuck dragged himself back to the beach. The wound continued bleeding for hours. Without proper medical supplies, infection became a serious threat. As evening arrived, dark storm clouds began gathering above the island soon. Heavy rain started falling. The storm made everything worse. Chuck tried protecting the packages and supplies he had collected by covering them with the broken raft. But the wind was strong and cold. His injured leg made it difficult to move. Desperate to escape the rain, Chuck searched for shelter. Eventually, he discovered a small cave hidden between large rocks near the jungle. The cave was narrow but dry. Chuck crawled inside and collapsed onto the ground. His body was shaking from exhaustion. To stay conscious, he drank a few mouthfuls of dirty rainwater that had collected inside a small depression in the rock. It tasted terrible, but he had no choice. Soon after, his body finally gave up. Chuck lost consciousness. The next morning he woke up with sharp pain shooting through his leg. When he looked at the wound, fear gripped him. The cut had become swollen and red. Signs of infection were beginning to appear. Chuck realized he needed something to treat the injury. But the island offered very few resources. For the first time since the crash, Chuck finally decided to open the cargo packages. He returned to the beach and sat beside the pile. He had carefully protected for weeks. One by one, he began tearing them open. Inside the packages he found several strange and unexpected items. There were multiple videotapes, a beautifully wrapped volleyball, a long, elegant black dress, and a pair of ice skates. At first, the items seemed completely useless. None of them looked like survival tools. But Chuck quickly realized that the metal blades attached to the ice skates could be extremely valuable. They were sharp enough to cut. Using the skate blade, Chuck carefully cleaned his wound and removed infected tissue as best as he could. Then he used foam packaging material from one of the boxes to cover the injury. He tied the makeshift bandage using shoelaces from the shoes he had taken from the dead pilot. It wasn't perfect medical treatment, but it helped stop the infection from spreading further. Over the next few days, Chuck began finding creative uses for the items from the packages. The black dress contained thin fabric that he could tear into strips. He used the cloth to create a simple fishing net. The videotape film inside the cassette cases was surprisingly strong. When pulled apart, it worked like rope. Chuck used the tape to tie pieces of wood together. Slowly, his situation on the island improved. He was able to catch more fish using the net. The food gave him strength. But the biggest challenge still remained: fire. Without fire, life on the island remained extremely difficult. Cooking food would make it safer to eat. Fire would also allow him to signal passing ships. So once again, Chuck began trying to create it. He gathered dry wood and began rubbing 2 sticks together. Hours passed. His hands became sore again. Still nothing. The frustration slowly began building inside him. He tried again the next day, and again the next. Morning until night he rubbed sticks together, hoping for even the smallest spark. But nothing worked. Days of failure finally pushed Chuck to the edge. One afternoon, exhausted and furious, he threw one of the packages across the beach. The volleyball rolled across the sand and stopped near the water. Chuck walked toward it slowly. As he picked it up, he noticed something strange.